Not My First Language, a memoir. Written and read by Reena Arora-Sánchez. Interlude. The aging faces of his parents beamed with pride, their light brown skin folding into corners he'd never seen before. Or maybe he just hadn't noticed. When did they get old? He wondered. How long had it been since he'd left Ellie? "Mummy," he whispered, almost incredulous. Her thick black hair was wrapped in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Coconut oil illuminated the strands combed to precision at the top of her head. The pale green sari draped around her 4-foot 8-inch frame brought out the hazel flecks that were often lost in her brown eyes. She looked up to admire her youngest, who was now taller than everyone else, the baby of the family with his mother's looks and personality. "Pitaji," he marveled. His father's gray button-down shirt and brown slacks were as neatly pressed as any respectable businessman's. His hairline, though receding, crest into an obsidian wave. His prominent square jaw lined up just below his son's. His ancestral Eurasian features hardened from surviving exhausting battles his descendants would never have to fight. For the first time in a long time, the tendons lining his neck were visible. Weight loss from decreasing cortisol, now that the children had all been educated. His parents stood side by side, watching the 5th and final son they'd sent off to the Americas for a better life. Finally, it was over. No one in their bloodline would be a refugee ever again. Just as he reached for his mom and dad, a sharp rattle stimulated consciousness, the unapologetic buzz of the first item he'd purchased in New York City. That alarm clock was the only thing keeping him on top of his chaotic shifts in the emergency room, when he had time to sleep anyway. In Toronto, his brother had served that purpose. He didn't immediately feel like pursuing his medical career when he arrived in Canada. Instead, he took minimum wage jobs at shoe stores and local hotels, sleeping on his brother's couch while he applied for residency programs in the United States. "Work is work, bhai. Time to get up," his older brother would say as he threw a wet washcloth at the younger. He'd groan and toss it back from his spot in the living room, barking, "Hey, watch it. This is the guy who carried Frank Sinatra's luggage, you know." The condo wasn't anything to brag about, but it was well taken care of. It smelled like home cooking. It protected the warmth of family. Not like that dump in Brooklyn he could barely afford on his beginner's salary. New York City, a place where so many had come before him to achieve greatness. How many had done it alone? The young resident slammed his left palm on the alarm clock to stop the buzzing, clinging to the sheetless pillow as he lay on his right side. 5 p.m. An hour to get ready, grab coffee and a bite at the corner diner, and make it to the hospital on time. He rolled onto his back and gazed up at the popcorn ceiling stained with water spots. Thin windows were no match for the signature sounds of sirens, car horns, or vermin trying to scratch their way through the crazed glass. He released a deep sigh as he reminded himself why he was doing this. "For the ones before me who couldn't," he exhaled. Intellectually, the young resident knew his loneliness was temporary. It had to be. He wanted the so-called American dream so badly he could feel it in his bones. It was the only reason he'd left his comfort zone in Toronto. He could have stayed there, made a life alongside his brother, found a nice French-Canadian wife, raised their mixed children somewhere in Ontario, close enough to Niagara Falls for day trips whenever the mood struck. But the possibilities in 1970s USA were far too tempting. He was going to make the struggle worth it. He had no choice. The springs of the mattress just inches above the damp wood flooring creaked as the young resident forced himself to get up. He was a lot of things. Stubborn, impatient, way too smart for his own good. But late? Never. Time is the one thing you can never get back, his father would say. Don't waste it, and don't disrespect other people by wasting theirs. The young resident walked over to the record player on the ground next to the bathroom door that wouldn't close all the way. His favorite Donna Summer LP was resting on the platter, as it had been for weeks. He turned on the record player and watched the album spin, then picked up the tone arm and rested the needle on the edge of the vinyl, all with the precision of a budding surgeon. He brushed his teeth, showered and shaved as his new favorite artist serenaded him through a nearly 18-minute medley that timed up perfectly with his grooming routine. He threw on a pair of bell-bottom slacks and a striped button-down shirt before double-checking his reflection to make sure his long black hair was feathered and flowing just right. The nurses loved it. As the young resident reached for the front door of his apartment, he noticed his makeshift doorknob was gone. Huh. Where was that balled-up black sock? Ah, he muttered as he disengaged the bolt at the top of the door, opened it, and realized the sock had somehow fallen into the hallway. He glanced to the left, then to the right. Had anyone seen that? Didn't seem like it. The illusion appeared secure. He stuffed the sock more firmly this time back into place, then locked the bolt from the outside with his key and rushed down to the diner below his building. 5:23. The diner wouldn't take long. It never did, especially when it was somewhere in between the lunch and dinner rushes. A bell on the door signaled his entry. He walked over to his usual table, not bothering to wait to be seated. The staff didn't mind. They almost expected it from him by now. "Hey, Doc," greeted the waitress after she spotted him, carafe in hand. "Coffee?" She motioned to the clean cup he'd just turned over on the table. "Yes, please," he said graciously, "and pastrami on rye with brown mustard." "You got it," she said with a wink, as if she hadn't anticipated his order. When the waitress sauntered away, something caught his attention in the corner behind her. The young resident ate most of his meals in this place and knew most of the other regulars. This wasn't exactly the type of neighborhood that attracted tourists. 3 men he'd never seen before, hunched over one another in a booth, were talking quietly, but not to the point where he couldn't tell it was a language he didn't understand. Maybe Spanish? He wasn't certain. Even though he was trilingual, he hadn't developed an ear for Romance languages beyond English. To him, "Cómo está" and "Cómo se va" were the same, and he couldn't tell you what either meant. The young resident was intrigued by these men. They didn't seem to notice him, but their behavior, the intensity in which they were engaged, the way one of them looked almost frightened, didn't sit right with him. A few seconds later, the man whose back wasn't turned to him caught the young resident staring. He had the kind of eyes that held secrets that carried consequences. The young resident was caught off guard by the color, piercing jade green. He also recognized that look from the emergency room, from women who'd fallen down the stairs, from children with mysterious bruises, from the parents of gunshot wound victims. Was this man silently pleading for help? Why? "Here you go, Doc." The waitress gently slid the white plate holding his sandwich onto the table in front of him, blocking his view of the men in the corner. He shook his head and smiled before handing her $6. "Keep the change," he insisted. She nodded. They'd done this dance before. She knew where he had to be. Speed was of the essence. The young resident took one more look at the table across the diner. The man who'd been staring at him was now heavily fixated on a small blot of ketchup that had fallen on his tie. It was as if their exchange had never happened. The young resident looked swiftly at his watch as the hospital's brand-new automatic doors opened to welcome him inside for another 36-hour shift. 5:58. He made his way toward the locker room adjacent to the doctor's lounge to exchange his black trench coat for a white jacket. "Hey," said a fellow resident sitting on a bench in the middle of the U-shaped layout. Exhaustion enveloped his throat. Bags overtook his eyes. His skin was so gray, he nearly blended into the shadows outside the jurisdiction of flickering overhead lights. He mustered a shaky smile at the young resident, a miracle for someone who'd just spent the last day and a half playing God. "Careful," joked the young resident. "If you sit on your ass any harder, you'll grow roots. Some of us came here to work, you know." His colleague laughed. "Caught me," he croaked. "It's been a real spa day. Only 45 DOAs instead of 70. I gotta get a hobby." "Slacker," the young resident bantered back, shaking his head. They'd learned to compartmentalize. Their sanity depended on it. "Well," the colleague continued, motioning to a pile of folders filled with patient notes, "let me know when you want to talk about everyone who's extending their stay at this lovely facility." The young resident sighed. No time like the present. The next few hours were like all the others before. High volume, high stress, low organization. It would be years before emergency medicine was classified as a distinct specialty. The soldiers of fortune did their best to keep hope and people alive as they worked upward of 90 hours at a time, stealing 20-minute power naps along the way. 2:22 a.m. The young resident took advantage of an uncharacteristically quiet window to grab some shut-eye. The hallway behind the nurse's desk was the safest bet to find solace. Inadequate lighting didn't encourage foot traffic, and the steady hum of conversation and pencil strokes against triplicate carbon copy sheets helped lull him to sleep. The floor reminded him of the one back home that cradled him, his brothers, and his cousins every night for years. Just as the familiarity helped him doze off, another arrival. The young resident leapt onto his feet as the paramedic's booming voice carried over the commotion. "What'd the bus bring us?" the young resident asked quickly. "Doc, we got a male approximately 35, single GSW to the left chest, mid-axillary, sucking chest wound. We sealed it with Vaseline gauze. BP is 90 palpable, pulse 120 and thready." "Lung appears to be down," the young resident called out calmly yet authoritatively as the trauma response team wheeled the patient past the smoke-filled waiting room and into the first available space they could find. "I need uncross-matched O-neg now," he continued. As the trauma team swirled to follow orders, the young resident looked down at the man's face. Time stopped. The frantic, organized chaos of the ER came to a standstill. Nurses, assistants, patients, doctors, all freezing in unison. The crescendo of sirens, conversation, and cries suddenly swallowed by a high-frequency ringing that only the young resident could hear. It couldn't be. Was that the guy he'd seen earlier at the diner? The one whose jade green eyes had signaled for help? The patient had the same round face with a complexion nearly as dark as the young resident's, wearing a mustard yellow shirt. Then there was the ketchup stain on the brown tie. Unmistakable, even amid blood splatter. "Doctor?" asked one of the nurses, ushering the world back in. He hadn't heard the question. But despite what the young resident tried, it was clear this man was getting worse by the second. There was no time to doubt his instincts. "Call the OR," the young resident advised. As the pandemonium of the moment subsided and the trauma team moved the patient away, the young resident felt an uncomfortable shift in his gut. Something about the last couple of minutes hadn't felt right. But what? He stood paralyzed in the hallway, adrenaline fading, wondering what he'd just done. "First, do no harm," he whispered to himself, a reminder of the oath by which he and so many others swore. He hadn't done any harm. So why couldn't he shake the feeling that he had? The passage of time continued. More patients revolved through the doors of the emergency room. In and out. In and out. Drug addicts with skin like ashen slate. Gunshot wound victims carrying the weight of neighborhood rivalries. Car accident intakes that offered more hope than the latter. The young resident continued doing what he could to send them back home to their families. Parents, siblings, spouses, and children, who might not have even been aware that their loved one was fighting death in the middle of the night. Though he put as much of his focus on these patients as possible, visions of the man in the diner laying on that gurney with a collapsed lung flashed within his psyche. 7:15 a.m. As the night turned to morning and the sun peaked above graffiti-scarred buildings along the Brooklyn-Queens border, he asked for a status update on the patient they'd rushed to the OR. The on-duty nurse mentioned his room number, saying something along the lines of him being in critical condition. There was more, but the young resident couldn't process it. He just needed to see the man for himself. "Thank you," he mumbled as he briskly made his way toward the recovery room. The young resident found the patient lying in a bed attached to a bulk physiological recorder, its tiny CRT screen throwing a sickly green glow over the man's face. The ECG line bounced in a rhythmic zigzag. A mechanical ventilator whizzed and clicked, forcing air through his lungs. On the floor, glass drainage bottles bubbled steadily, a dark, crimson-tinted froth churning in the water-filled chambers. 2 IV poles stood guard, the clear bottles hanging like heavy fruit above the man's limp arms. A metal clipboard at the foot of the bed told the story. The young resident picked it up and glanced at the man's vitals. Steady at last check. He sighed and said a silent prayer, hoping he'd done enough to be able to run into the man at the diner again one night before another shift. Maybe talk about their shared experience in that hospital. The man would hug him, thank him, tell him about his wife and kids and how the whole thing had been a horrible misunderstanding. Wrong place, wrong time, something like that. Something like that. 12:28 p.m. The young resident retreated to the floor in the hallway behind the nurse's station. One of the nurses gently shook his shoulder with her left hand. He smelled the smoke from the cigarette nestled between her right index and middle fingers before opening his eyes. "Doc, I'm sorry," she lamented once he'd turned his head toward her. She meant it. He looked like he needed a nap. "There's a guy out there asking for you, something about his brother who came through here last night." The young resident scrambled to his feet as the nurse's voice trailed off in the background. This had to be about the man from the diner. He was right. They stood out in the waiting room, the 2 men sitting across from the patient in that booth the evening before, still impeccably dressed in the same suits, hunched over in the same manner like 2 halves of a single thought. They were much shorter than he expected, though, barely up to his shoulders. Yet their presence alone intimidated him, made him feel exposed in a way he didn't understand. The nurse followed the young resident out to the waiting room, referring to one of them as the man's brother and giving him the latest from the recovery room as she knew it. If we're talking about the same guy, anyway. The young resident was almost more concerned with the supposed relationship between the patient and these 2 men than his condition. What he'd seen hours before didn't look like sibling behavior as he knew it. It was more like transactional silence. But now wasn't the time for speculation. It was time for action. He remembered who he was, a doctor who had treated a patient, and forced himself to detach from his feelings. He cleared his throat and rolled his shoulders back, manifesting an invisible cloak of authority. After all, this was his hospital. He was literally saving lives. What could these 2 do to him? What could anyone do to him? "Excuse me," his voice cracked as he approached the men. "The nurse told me you had some questions for me?" The men didn't seem to recognize him, or if they did, they didn't let on that they'd seen him in that diner, that their brother or whomever had been trying to send him a message from afar. "Oh, Jess," one of them gently replied with what he deduced was a South American accent. "My brother, he is, this tall." The man brought his right hand up to his forehead. "Skin like mine, como tú, como café. He was shot in the chest." The young resident hesitated. They seemed so much larger, so much more powerful than the tiny fellow immigrants standing before him, seeking answers through large doe eyes and soft voices. How dangerous could they be? Oh, he replied. Right. Can you confirm his name for me, just so I know we're talking about the correct person? Alvaro Uribe Restrepo, the man answered calmly. The young resident struggled with the unfamiliar accent. It was different from any he'd grown up with on the other side of the world. His ear couldn't quite process the relationship of sounds. I'm so sorry, he lamented. Can you please repeat that a little more slowly for me? It's been a long night. The man smiled, held up his hands, and cocked his head. No problem, he insisted. He said the name again, this time with a slight American English accent, in hopes that it would be clear enough for the young resident. Alvaro Uribe Restrepo. The young resident recalled 3 names on the chart hanging from the bed in the recovery room. Got it, he replied, collecting his thoughts as he rubbed his forehead with his left hand, his right hand resting on his hip. He tried to remember what the nurse had told him. Well, I haven't seen him in a few hours, but according to the nurse, his vital signs were stable, which is positive, but he's also critical. He's using a ventilator to help him breathe, unfortunately. He'll need to stay here for a bit until we know what we're dealing with, the young resident continued. The men nodded. No emotion, just acceptance. The young resident waited a moment before asking if there was anything else he could do for them. Yes, actually, said the man who'd inquired about his brother's condition. He motioned for the young resident to come closer, as if he were holding on to state-secret information that only he were permitted to hear. In an act of respect, the young resident stepped forward and tilted his head to line up with the man's lips. You cannot let him leave, the man said. You do. We kill you. The young resident recoiled, his pulse banging in his ears. The threat hung in the air, filling the space between them and triggering his asthma. He grabbed his chest as he stared at the 2 pocket-sized titans who'd come to his place of work to threaten his life. Their eyes were flat, unreadable, cold and serious. But they couldn't be serious, could they? What? Was all the young resident could muster as he composed himself. He had to stay calm for everyone around him. Patients, staff, fellow physicians. He didn't know what he was dealing with, and the last thing he wanted was to create a scene that could unintentionally put dozens of people in harm's way. The men smiled confidently before the one who'd been driving the conversation repeated himself. Disculpe, I know you have a little trouble with my accent, he quipped. If he lives, you die. Dr. Arora. The young resident fought the urge to pass out. How on earth did they know his name? No one had ever threatened him for doing his job, let alone for saving someone's life. The 2 men didn't wait for a response. They tipped their wool felt hats and quietly walked out of the hospital, regaining anonymity on the crowded streets of Brooklyn. The young resident yelped when the nurse returned and surprised him with a cold hand to his left shoulder. Doc, you look like you've seen a ghost, she chuckled. You okay? I didn't mean to be in your way. It's just those guys are from the same town in Colombia where my mom is from, so I just wanted to make sure you could understand them. Her voice trailed off. The young resident remained fixated on the entrance to the ER. Were they really gone? Would they come back? What if he wasn't around when the patient woke up? What if he did die from his injuries? How did they know his name? If they knew his name, surely they knew where he lived, where he ate. The young resident glared at the nurse with an intensity that frightened her, brushing past her without saying a word. 9:30 p.m. The young resident stood over the foot of the man's bed, again. Vitals were still stable, condition still critical. The young resident replayed the confrontation with whoever had threatened him in that waiting room over and over. If he lives, you die. The young resident sighed. For a moment, he allowed his mind to wander to a place that had once seemed unimaginable. The man couldn't breathe on his own. It would be easy to simply unplug the ventilator, pretend it had been a horrible accident. Who would know? The recovery room didn't have nearly as much activity as the ER. It was quiet, save for the occasional doctor or nurse checking on a patient or responding to a signal from a machine. The nurses were taught to listen to the doctors. They were gods in this place. No one would question him. He thought about his parents, saw his father's proud face, his mother's loving eyes. "No," he hissed to himself. "First, do no harm." 5:47 a.m. "Doc, that guy's family's here again. I checked and it looks like there's no change. I know you're off in a few minutes, but..." The young resident looked up from the clipboard he was studying with another patient's details. He cocked his head toward the direction of the waiting room, above the petite half-Colombian nurse who was also still on shift. He closed his eyes, inhaled, exhaled. He slid a few inches closer, just enough so he could see the entrance of the ER for himself. She was right. They were back. Different suits, same mission. He looked down at the nurse who was eagerly awaiting his order and made a choice. "Go ahead. Tell them what you know." She hesitated, her face twisted in confusion. It wasn't protocol for nurses to talk with patients' loved ones without the presence of a physician. She didn't want to risk losing her job. Are you sure, Doc? You don't want to do it?" He paused and glanced toward the waiting room one more time, then again at her. "I need to go take care of something," he insisted. "You be fine." He pivoted from the nurse and headed toward the recovery room. The man was still hanging by a thread, the machines fulfilling their obligation to keep him alive as long as his body would cooperate. The young resident stood at the side of his bed, arms crossed. "What did you do?" he murmured. "What did you do that got us both in trouble?" He couldn't stop the tears from forming. Is this why his parents had survived partition? So he could die at the hands of God knows who on the other side of the world? Just for doing what he was educated to do? He shouldn't even be here. He wanted to be a pilot. "You're going to be a doctor," his father had insisted. "For all of us who didn't have the chance to go to school." Like most things, studying came relatively easy to the young resident. He'd turned the marathon of medical school into a sprint, enrolling in 3 classes at a time and sweet-talking fellow students into voraciously taking notes so he could cross the finish line faster. When he got bored of working smarter, not harder, and left for Canada, he wanted nothing to do with medicine for a while. "I need a break," he told his dad. "A break from what?" his father scoffed back. "Surviving?" Something like that. When the letter from the hospital residency program arrived 2 years later, he was ready. He was tired of living paycheck to paycheck, of bumming on his brother's couch, of feeling powerless in a world where success equaled financial freedom, where ambition was his priority. He had wanted a break, yes, but being too lax for too long also aggravated him. So this was how his story ended? He'd never get married, never have kids, never see his parents or his brothers again? All because he treated the wrong patient at the wrong time? He wasn't sure if it was the threat of death or lack of sleep, or both, that had a chokehold on his thoughts. As he wrestled between logic and emotion, he suddenly found himself in survival mode. The young resident took another look at the patient whose status hadn't changed since leaving the operating room. Then again at the ventilator plugged into the wall. His mind quieted. He breathed in and out, matching the rhythm of the machines. First, do no harm. This chapter reflects my personal recollections and is not intended to serve as a factual record. Memory is imperfect, and others might recall events differently. Certain names, details, and dialogue have been altered or reconstructed for clarity and privacy.